They thought the night would be about wealth and power, until a single voice cut through the golden noise, rewriting every story in the room. If you enjoy stories where pride meets truth and hearts are transformed, don't forget to subscribe for more. The wind off Lake Michigan carried a sharp winter bite, sweeping down the frozen streets of Chicago's Gold Coast and rattling the bare branches of the elm trees lining Astor Street. The great houses, limestone and brick, some with turrets, others with pillared porticos, stood in solemn ranks, their windows glowing like a necklace of warm amber beads strung along the icy shore. In the largest of them all, Jonathan Lancaster's mansion, the night was alive with light, heat, and the glittering hum of power. It was the Lancaster Winter Gala, the kind of evening that made society columns hum for weeks afterward. Limousines idled at the curb while valets, wrapped in wool coats, opened doors for senators, judges, investment magnates, and museum board directors. Inside, the double doors of the ballroom stood open, revealing crystal chandeliers, pouring light onto polished oak floors and walls hung with Flemish tapestries. The air was perfumed with peonies flown in from Ecuador, their blush-pink petals the only softness in a room defined by ambition. Jonathan Lancaster himself, silver at the temples and faultless in a midnight blue tuxedo, moved through the crowd like a conductor through an orchestra, nodding here, shaking hands there, his smile honed to a perfect degree of warmth without intimacy. Tonight was not merely about champagne and string quartets. Tonight, he intended to display his latest acquisition, a papyrus scroll from 3rd century BCE Greece, purchased from a private collector in Boston. According to the whispers among the scholarly elite, it was unique and undeciphered. The display was set at the center of the great library, a room whose walls climbed 2 stories to a coffered ceiling. Mahogany ladders rolled on brass rails. At the center, under glass, lay the papyrus. Fragile, tawny, its edges frayed like the hem of an ancient garment. Tiny Greek letters, faded to the color of tea, ran in neat, unwavering lines. Jonathan drew a small knot of guests toward the case. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to applause. "You are looking at history itself, a 2,300-year-old message from the Hellenistic world, written in a dialect so obscure that no living scholar has managed to fully translate it." A ripple of impressed murmurs passed through the group. Senator Caldwell bent closer to the glass. "And you think you can?" Jonathan's smile deepened. "I have commissioned several attempts. Each has failed. But perhaps that is part of its charm. Some treasures are meant to remain mysteries." Near the door to the adjoining hallway, Evelyn Carter paused in her work, a tray of champagne flutes balanced easily in her hands. She had been Jonathan's housekeeper for 3 years, a figure so unremarkable to the guests that their eyes slid over her as if she were part of the polished oak paneling. Her black dress and white apron fit neatly, her brown hair coiled at the nape of her neck. But when Jonathan tilted the display case toward the light, her gaze flicked to the papyrus and stayed there for a heartbeat longer than necessary. She recognized the script instantly, not the tidy Attic Greek of textbooks, but something rougher, older, Coptic Greek with traces of Egyptian influence. The kind of writing you saw in dusty storerooms in Cairo or on fragments left behind by soldiers who'd crossed half the known world. She turned away before anyone could notice. Jonathan, however, caught the movement. He mistook it for curiosity and filed it away. The party rolled on. The quartet in the corner slipped into Debussy. Waiters in white gloves passed smoked salmon tartlets and caviar blinis. In the conservatory, a cluster of trustees from the Field Museum argued amiably over a proposed exhibition budget. Across the hall, in the smaller blue salon, a pair of venture capitalists traded whispers about a senator's rumored scandal. Through it all, Evelyn moved quietly, replenishing glasses, clearing plates, and making sure every candle burned steadily. She did not linger near the library again, though she could hear Jonathan's voice carrying in from time to time, telling the papyrus's story with the practiced cadence of a man who knew how to enchant a crowd. Outside, snow began to fall, slow, heavy flakes that turned the black ribbon of Lakeshore Drive into a hazy silver line. Through the ballroom windows, it looked almost staged, as if even the weather had been choreographed for the Lancaster Winter Gala. By 11 o'clock, the ballroom was crowded shoulder to shoulder, and the air had grown warm. The papyrus remained the star of the night, framed in glass under the halo of a brass lamp. Evelyn passed the doorway once more, her eyes brushing over the faded letters, and this time Jonathan saw the focus in her gaze. It was too precise to be idle curiosity. He smiled faintly, a man sensing an opportunity to demonstrate his own dominance. The thought came quickly, a harmless test, something to amuse the guests, a way to remind everyone that in this house, no secret survived Jonathan Lancaster's stage. But for Evelyn Carter, the night was about to tilt, and the first fracture would come from the very artifact Jonathan thought beyond her reach. The storm outside had grown heavier, snow pressed against the mansion's tall windows. The world beyond blurred into an impressionist wash of white and faint street lamp halos. Inside, the air was thick with the perfume of winter roses and the faint mineral scent of melting ice from guests' coats. The Lancaster Winter Gala had reached that hour when conversations slowed into smaller, more pointed circles. The moment when a clever host might ignite something memorable to carry into tomorrow's headlines. Jonathan Lancaster stood in the library again, surrounded by a tighter cluster of guests than before. He had drawn them back with the practiced ease of a man who knew when the night was drifting toward the ordinary. This, he told himself, was the moment to cement his place as not just a collector, but a showman. At his right stood Dr. Helena Voss, the formidable linguist from Northwestern University. Tall, with silver hair swept into a sleek chignon and a floor-length gown of emerald velvet, she radiated the kind of authority that made graduate students tremble and donors lean in. Her reputation was not merely academic. Helena was known for skewering pretenders with a single raised eyebrow. Jonathan gestured toward the papyrus in its brass-lit glass case. "Helena, you've seen enough of these to know. The dialect alone is nearly impenetrable, am I right?" Helena stepped closer, peering down through rimless glasses. "It's certainly complex. A hybrid script. I'd place it somewhere between late Hellenistic Greek and Coptic influence, possibly from Alexandria during the Ptolemaic era. But yes, it's challenging." Her tone was measured, not dismissive, but Jonathan caught the hint of intrigue. Around them, guests leaned in, sensing an opportunity for something unscripted. Jonathan's gaze slid past her shoulder to where Evelyn Carter was passing through the library doorway, a silver tray of champagne balanced with ease. He watched the moment Helena's eyes narrowed toward the papyrus, then flicked to Evelyn. A thought sparked in Jonathan's mind, dangerous in the way only pride-fueled ideas could be. "Miss Carter," he called across the room. The conversations hushed just enough for his voice to carry. Evelyn paused mid-step, surprised to hear her name spoken so clearly in a room where her presence was usually invisible. Every instinct told her to keep walking, to fade into the background again. But Jonathan was the host, and her employer. She turned, meeting his gaze. "Yes, sir?" Her voice was even, polite. Jonathan's smile widened, drawing the crowd's attention toward her. "You seemed rather interested in my papyrus earlier. Tell me, do you read ancient Greek?" The guests reacted with a ripple of low laughter, the polite kind, laced with a hint of condescension. A few exchanged glances. The idea of a housekeeper translating a 2,300-year-old text in front of Chicago's cultural elite was absurd enough to be amusing. Evelyn's grip on the tray tightened slightly. She had learned long ago that public humiliation was a tool of the powerful. "A little," she replied. Jonathan's eyebrows rose theatrically. "A little, you say? Well, let's make this interesting." He turned to the audience. $250,000 to anyone in this room who can give me an accurate translation, right here, right now. The sum drew a gasp from somewhere in the back. Even for this crowd, it was a number worth noting. Jonathan let the silence stretch a beat longer before adding, "Miss Carter, would you care to try?" Every eye turned toward her. Some were curious. Others clearly expected her to decline and retreat. Helena's expression, however, was harder to read, something between concern and challenge. Evelyn set the tray down on a side table, her movements deliberate. She walked toward the display case, the muted rustle of her skirt audible in the hush. Jonathan unlocked the glass lid with a flourish, as though offering her a sword in an arena. She bent over the papyrus. Her eyes scanned the faded ink, tracing the flow of letters that had crossed centuries to land under her gaze. It was exactly what she had suspected the night before. A personal letter, written in an informal hand, the words carrying the warmth of a life lived beyond monuments and wars. When she began to speak, her voice was low but steady, the cadence shifting into the natural rhythm of the Greek before flowing into English. "To my beloved, the Nile runs high this season, and the pomegranates have split under the sun. I have kept your ring on my hand and your name in my mouth. The days are long without your footsteps in the courtyard. The doves still return to the wall at dusk, waiting as I do. Do not let the snows of Gaul harden you. Remember the heat of our city, the taste of wine from the western hills. Until the stars forget their places in the sky, I will remain yours." Her translation wrapped around the room like warm silk, and for a moment the crowd forgot themselves. The air seemed to still, the snow outside silent against the glass. Evelyn straightened, meeting no one's eye, and stepped back. Helena was the first to speak. "That," she said firmly, "is accurate, and delivered with understanding of idiom and historical context. Whoever wrote this was no court scribe, a soldier's wife, perhaps. A woman writing from Alexandria to someone stationed at the edge of the empire." A murmur passed through the guests, this time without laughter. Someone exhaled sharply, as though they'd been holding their breath. Jonathan recovered quickly, clapping his hands together once. "Well, there you have it. Our very own, what shall I call you? Scholar in residence?" His tone held a glimmer of amusement, as if to frame the whole thing as a charming novelty. But Helena didn't smile. "You should know, Jonathan, that what she just did takes years of training, and that you may have underestimated her by a factor of—" She glanced at Evelyn. "Let's say, a lifetime." Evelyn inclined her head slightly, neither accepting the compliment nor rejecting it. She simply returned to the side table, picked up her tray, and resumed her work as if nothing had happened. Still, the ripple her words had created didn't fade. Guests exchanged murmured comments. A museum trustee whispered to his wife about a fellowship opening. Someone else wondered aloud what her academic background might be. And Jonathan, for all his skill at commanding a room, found himself oddly aware of the fact that the night's most memorable moment had not come from him. The rest of the evening moved on, but not without a subtle shift in the air. In the ballroom, music resumed. In the conservatory, glasses clinked and laughter returned. Yet whenever Evelyn passed, conversations paused for half a beat longer than they should have. Not from pity or derision, but from something else. the faint recognition of a story they hadn't expected to find in a house like this. Jonathan felt it too. He told himself it was harmless, an entertaining diversion for his guests. But somewhere under the polished layers of pride, a small unease had taken root. The kind that comes when a narrative you've written for the world no longer fits as neatly as it once did. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, under the chandelier's steady light, the papyrus lay quietly in its case, a message from the past, now twice translated, once in ink on reed, and once in the voice of a woman who had, until this night, been invisible. The snow had deepened into drifts along Astor Street, blanketing the Gold Coast in a muffled stillness. But inside the Lancaster mansion, the air felt anything but quiet. The echo of Evelyn's voice still seemed to linger between the coffered beams of the library ceiling, a resonance that neither champagne nor polite conversation could fully dissolve. Jonathan Lancaster stood near the papyrus display, his fingers resting lightly on the brass edge of the case. Around him, the conversations had fractured into small, urgent knots, like whirlpools in a current, each pulling in its own direction. On one side of the room, a senator and a venture capitalist whispered about raw, untapped talent, and whether Evelyn had been hiding a degree. Near the mantel, a museum trustee spoke in low tones to a curator from the Field Museum, speculating on how someone with such fluency could end up in domestic service. And in the corner, two socialites sipped champagne while exchanging arched eyebrows and theories dripping with skepticism. Helena Voss, still standing close to the display, seemed unwilling to let the moment fade into parlor entertainment. "Jonathan," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel, "you owe it to yourself, and to that artifact, to admit what you just witnessed was extraordinary." Jonathan's gaze slid toward her. Extraordinary, perhaps, but luck is often mistaken for genius. She could have heard something similar elsewhere, rehearsed it, and... Luck. Helena's interruption was soft, but it cut through the background murmur. "Jonathan, that text has never been published. Not a photograph, not a transcription. I saw your acquisition paperwork myself. The only people who have even glimpsed it are you, me, and now her." Across the room, a banker laughed too loudly, breaking the tension for a beat. "Well, maybe she's just got a knack for romance languages." The joke landed with a brittle chuckle from those who wanted to steer the conversation back into safe, familiar waters. Jonathan seized on the deflection. "Exactly. Let's not turn this into a recruitment fair. Tonight is about art, history, and..." His voice tightened as if catching itself on the edge of sincerity. "Hospitality." Evelyn, who had quietly returned to her duties, passed behind them carrying a tray of crystal coupes. Her posture was unyieldingly straight, her expression composed into something almost blank. Years of service had taught her that in moments like this, invisibility was the safest refuge. But invisibility was no longer entirely hers to claim. A young assistant curator, mid-20s, nervously holding a glass of white wine, stepped forward and asked in a hesitant voice, "Miss Carter, if you don't mind me asking, where did you learn to read that script?" For a fraction of a second, Evelyn's eyes flicked to Jonathan, silently measuring how much she could say without stepping into another snare. "University of Chicago," she replied simply, "and a few years abroad." The young man's eyebrows shot up. "Abroad?" She didn't elaborate. The murmurs swelled again. The story already growing in retelling. A housekeeper with doctoral training, perhaps even field work. Someone compared it to discovering your taxi driver used to be an astronaut. Jonathan forced a smile. And yet here she is, part of the Lancaster household staff where she belongs. A fine example of versatility. Helena's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake, Jonathan. Dismissing her publicly like this diminishes you, not her. But Jonathan was already turning toward another guest, using the motion as a graceful escape. He could feel the bruise forming on his ego, deep and stubborn. He was accustomed to being the source of awe in any room, the man with the rarest object, the sharpest insight, the final word. Tonight, for the first time in years, the center of gravity had shifted away from him. And it had shifted towards someone he paid to polish the silverware. In the blue salon, Evelyn replenished a row of candle votives, her mind working in quiet, disciplined order. She had not intended to reveal herself. The translation had been a risk, but she had calculated it might be safer to comply than to refuse in front of so many witnesses. Still, the aftershocks were more complex than she'd anticipated. Whispers had a way of shaping futures, for better or worse. She caught a glimpse of Helena speaking with a senator's wife, her hands moving in subtle, precise gestures. Helena was advocating for her, Evelyn could tell, but she knew better than to rely on anyone's patronage. The same circles that praised you over champagne could close their doors without warning. By the time midnight struck, the party had thinned. Guests braved the storm to slip into waiting cars, their mink collars pulled high, their goodbyes quick. The last echoes of laughter and string music faded, replaced by the muffled hum of the overnight cleaning crew. Evelyn moved through the empty rooms, collecting stray glasses, straightening chairs. She avoided the library entirely, leaving it to the silence it deserved. Jonathan lingered alone in the library after the final guest had gone. The papyrus lay under its glass like a captured whisper from the past. He poured himself a brandy, the amber liquid catching the lamplight, and stood over it. Part of him wanted to dismiss the evening's events as a fluke, an amusing anecdote to retell at his club. Imagine my housekeeper translating a Greek love letter. But another part, quieter and more insistent, replayed her voice in his mind. The way her cadence had matched the faded lines perfectly, as if she had been the intended recipient. He drained the glass and set it down harder than necessary. It was easier to attribute her skill to coincidence than to acknowledge the possibility that someone like Evelyn Carter might know a world he could not claim mastery over. And yet, he could not quite make himself believe it had been luck. By the next morning, the ripple had reached beyond the mansion. Jonathan's phone buzzed with messages from guests, some playful, others pointed. A venture capitalist asked if he planned to loan out his resident scholar for a museum project. A Chicago Tribune culture columnist sent a politely worded inquiry about the woman who brought a papyrus to life. Even his attorney had left a voicemail, half joking about non-disclosure agreements for household staff. Jonathan ignored them all. Publicly acknowledging Evelyn's abilities would mean conceding that he had failed to recognize, or worse, had willfully overlooked them. It would mean sharing credit. And for a man who built his reputation on the singularity of his vision, that was a difficult calculation to make. That afternoon, Helena Voss arrived unannounced. She found Jonathan in his study reviewing a portfolio of property developments. "You've had 24 hours, she said without preamble. "Tell me you've reconsidered." Jonathan didn't look up. Reconsidered what? Offering Evelyn a position worthy of her expertise before someone else does. He set the papers aside with deliberate slowness. "Helena, you know as well as I do that our world runs on more than just competence. It runs on presentation, connections, the right pedigree. You don't pluck someone from the servant's wing and place them in the curator's chair." Helena's eyes narrowed. "Our world, Jonathan, runs on people deciding who gets to be seen. Last night she was seen, and you can either acknowledge it or pretend you didn't notice. But make no mistake, the rest of us noticed." He leaned back, folding his hands. "I have my reasons." "Yes," she said, her voice turning cold. "Pride is one of them." The silence between them stretched. Helena finally shook her head and turned toward the door. I thought you collected history because you loved it. But perhaps you only collect what you can control. Her departure left a sharper chill in the study than the winter wind outside. In the kitchen, Evelyn finished her duties for the day, the house settling into its afternoon quiet. She was aware of the currents shifting above her, though she had no illusions about steering them. The gala had exposed a fragment of who she was, but the rest remained buried, by choice and by necessity. Still, she allowed herself one small act of defiance. On her way out, she paused at the library door, glanced once at the papyrus, and let the corner of her mouth curve, not into a smile, but into the ghost of a promise to herself. Jonathan might not be ready to admit what she was. But the world had a way of dragging truth into the light, and when it did, the shockwaves would reach far beyond the walls of this house. The storm began in earnest just after 10 o'clock. By midnight, it had become a siege. Snow flung itself against the Lancaster mansion in relentless sheets, driven sideways by wind roaring in from Lake Michigan. The broad steps at the front entrance vanished beneath a rising drift, and even the heated drive could not keep pace with the accumulation. The valets abandoned their posts, and the last handful of guests who had planned to leave lingered awkwardly in the foyer as the weather reports grew more dire. Jonathan stood near the double doors, scanning the whiteness beyond the glass. Nothing's moving out there, he said to no one in particular. The street lamps had disappeared behind curtains of snow, and the world beyond Astor Street might as well have been erased. Helena Voss stepped forward, her phone in hand. The city's issued a travel ban. Roads are closed. You'll have a full house tonight. It was not the arrangement Jonathan had anticipated. The winter gala was meant to end with photographs in the society pages, not with senators and museum trustees bunking in guest rooms like stranded travelers. Still, he adjusted with the same surface-level grace he applied to any inconvenience. Very well, he said. We'll make arrangements. Bedrooms along the east wing are available. Staff will bring extra linens. Evelyn, silent in the background, exchanged a glance with the head butler. She had already anticipated the needs. Hot tea for those unaccustomed to winter's bite, fires laid in every fireplace, discreet delivery of slippers and blankets. Years of service had taught her that comfort was an invisible art, most successful when no one noticed it was being managed. By 1 a.m., the house had settled into a strange stillness. Guests disappeared into borrowed robes and quilted coverlets. The grand staircase creaked occasionally under someone's hesitant step. Outside, the blizzard erased all sound except the wind's hollow moan. Evelyn made her final round through the kitchen, banking the fire in the hearth before stepping into the dim hallway leading toward the library. She did not expect anyone to be awake there, but she carried with her a small oil lamp, the kind used during power flickers, its glass chimney glowing amber. The library door was ajar. Inside, Jonathan sat alone in an armchair near the hearth, a glass of brandy on the side table. The firelight painted him in shifting tones of copper and shadow. On the central table lay the papyrus, still under its protective glass, but beside it now sat another book. A facsimile of Sophocles, its spine cracked from age. Jonathan looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his features. Couldn't sleep either? He asked. Evelyn hesitated. I was making sure the fires wouldn't die before morning. He gestured toward the chair opposite him. Join me. No staff duties tonight. You're as much a prisoner of the storm as anyone. For a moment, she considered declining. But the library was warm, the wind's howl muffled behind thick drapes, and there was something in his voice, not quite softened but less performative than usual. She set the lamp on a side table and took the seat. Jonathan poured a measure of brandy into a second glass and slid it toward her. She shook her head. Thank you, but I prefer tea. He sipped his own. I suppose I owe you an acknowledgement at least. Last night was unexpected. Unexpected for you? She said, her tone even. Not for me. The fire popped sharply, sending a thin stream of sparks up the chimney. Jonathan leaned forward, elbows on knees. You didn't just stumble onto that translation. I saw the way you looked at the text, like you'd known it your whole life. I have known its kind, she said. He waited, but she did not elaborate. The silence pressed between them until he finally asked, Where did you learn to read like that? Evelyn reached into the satchel she carried, plain leather, its strap worn smooth, and drew out a notebook. The cover was scuffed, the edges softened by years of use. She opened it to a page filled with Greek characters written in a precise hand, each annotated with notes in English, French, and Arabic. Jonathan's eyebrows lifted. You keep this with you? Always, she said. It's a habit from fieldwork. You never know when you'll encounter something worth remembering. He glanced down at the text. Fieldwork? In Chicago? Her mouth curved faintly, the closest thing to a smile he had seen from her. In Cairo, and Alexandria, and once in Thessaloniki, though that was more by accident than plan. He stared at her. You're telling me you worked on site in Egypt? I was a doctoral candidate at the University of Chicago, classical philology, specializing in late Hellenistic epigraphy. I partnered with the Cairo Museum for a project on multilingual inscriptions during the Ptolemaic period. She said it plainly, without embellishment, as though reciting a grocery list. Jonathan leaned back slowly. The firelight caught in the amber of his drink, making it look like a lens into another world. And now you're here, he said. Yes. Why? Her eyes lowered to the notebook. The politics of academia are precise. If you don't fit the pattern, you find yourself cut out of the fabric. Grants vanish. Conference panels fill without your name. Eventually, the work you love becomes a door you're no longer allowed to open. Jonathan swirled his drink, listening to the soft glug of liquid against crystal. So you walked away. I refuse to spend my life knocking on a door that would never open again. This job pays the rent. It gives me quiet. That's more than many get. He studied her for a long moment. In the golden lamplight, she seemed carved from something steadier than the brittle elegance of the gala crowd, a presence rooted deeper than titles or fortunes. On the table between them, the papyrus gleamed under glass. Jonathan gestured toward it. Tell me something no one else has told me about this. Evelyn rose and moved closer to the display. She bent over the fragile fibers, tracing the script with her eyes. The handwriting is personal, not professional. The irregular spacing suggests someone writing without a scribe. And see here. She pointed to a faint symbol at the end of a line. That's an astrological marker. It was common for lovers to include them, like a private seal. Whoever wrote this wasn't just literate. They were intimate with the rhythms of both language and the stars. Jonathan found himself leaning forward, following the line of her gesture. And you read that from... What? Ink and shadows? From paying attention, she said. The clock on the mantel chimed 2. Outside, the blizzard still roared, but inside, the air felt oddly still, as though the rest of the house had fallen away, leaving only the two of them and the echo of a voice written 2,000 years ago. Jonathan cleared his throat. You know, there are people in this city, in my circle, who would pay far more than $250,000 for that kind of insight. Evelyn straightened, returning to her chair. And there are people in this city who would rather keep certain voices out of the conversation entirely. You know which side you're on, Mr. Lancaster. Her words settled between them, heavy but without malice. Jonathan did not answer immediately. He found himself wondering, for the first time, whether his carefully curated world might be smaller than he had realized. The fire burned low. Evelyn rose, collected her lamp, and paused at the door. "Get some sleep," she said. "The storm won't break until morning." Jonathan watched her go, the faint sway of the lamplight shrinking down the hall. Alone again, he looked back at the papyrus. The faded script seemed to waver in the firelight, like a voice he was only beginning to hear. The storm outside had calmed to a steady hiss against the windows, the kind of snow that fell so densely it blurred the world into soft edges. In the library, the fire had burned down to a bed of deep coals, glowing like the heart of something ancient. Jonathan sat in the high-backed chair opposite Evelyn, the lamplight between them painting her features in warm gold and shadow. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was not the brittle kind that comes before an argument. It was dense, waiting, as if both of them sensed that once it was broken, something long hidden would surface. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You told me last night you worked in Cairo. You mentioned the University of Chicago. That's not a detail you drop into casual conversation. So I'm asking, what happened? Why aren't you there now?" Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "Because I wasn't the right fit," she said, her tone clipped. But she must have seen that he wasn't going to let the conversation end there. She set her notebook on the table, folded her hands in her lap, and exhaled slowly. "You want the whole story?" she asked. "I do," Jonathan said. She looked past him, toward the shelves lined with first editions and monographs. "I started in classics because it was the one place where my curiosity didn't get me into trouble. I could sit for hours with a fragment of text, tracing the way a single letter changed over centuries. Paleography, the study of old handwriting, is like reading the mind of someone who's been dead for 2,000 years. It's intimate, meticulous, and utterly addictive." Jonathan nodded, though he stayed quiet. "I was a doctoral candidate at the University of Chicago," she went on. "Full fellowship. My dissertation was on bilingual inscriptions from the Ptolemaic period, Greek and Demotic Egyptian. I had field placements in Alexandria, then a 6-month research term at the Cairo Museum. My advisor called my work dangerously original. I thought it was a compliment." "It wasn't?" Jonathan asked. Evelyn's mouth curved faintly, though not in amusement. "In academia, dangerously original means you're stepping outside the safe corridors. It means your findings might embarrass the wrong people, contradict the pet theories of someone who's been publishing on the same niche topic for 20 years, and if those people are on your dissertation committee, you've just walked into a room where the door locks from the inside." Her voice shifted then, taking on the cadence of memory. "I still remember my defense. I stood there for 2 hours presenting my findings. How certain inscriptions showed not just translation, but code switching, deliberate blending of cultures. One professor leaned back in his chair the whole time, tapping his pen. When I finished, he smiled and said, 'You've made a very clever argument, Ms. Carter, but I'm afraid it's speculative.'" Jonathan frowned. Speculative? It was his way of saying he didn't want to deal with the implications. My evidence was solid, cross-referenced, dated, supported by comparative texts. But if my conclusion stood, it meant rethinking half a century of scholarship. And that, she said, was never going to happen with me in the room. "What about your advisor?" "He voted for me, but he was outnumbered." 2-1. The committee sent me away with a revise and resubmit, which in my field is often just a polite burial. She leaned back, her gaze still fixed on some point in the past. After that, the invitations stopped coming. No conference panels, no grant renewals. When I applied for visiting lectureships, the responses were slow and apologetic. Friends stopped returning calls. It's amazing how fast the floor drops out when the right doors close. Jonathan felt a slow, unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. So you left. I had to. I took a job in a museum archive in Boston for a while. It paid barely enough to live on. And every day I watched less qualified men get the projects I'd trained for because they knew the right people or looked the part. After 2 years, I quit. I moved here. The Lancaster household job was posted under private service positions. I took it because it was steady, anonymous, and far from all of that. The fire popped, sending a thin thread of smoke into the room's warmth. Jonathan studied her, the measured way she spoke, the absence of self-pity in her voice. She wasn't telling him this to earn his sympathy. She was telling him because he'd asked, and because the truth was something she treated like the papyrus, fragile, but meant to be handled directly. What you're describing, he said carefully, sounds like politics, not scholarship. In academia, they're the same thing, she replied. You'd understand if you saw how much of it depends on endowments, on who funds which project. It's not unlike your world, except instead of shareholders, we have tenure committees. Jonathan thought of the dinners he'd attended, the casual decisions over wine that determined the fate of entire exhibitions. He'd always known the process was political, but hearing it from her, the stakes felt sharper. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded sheet of archival paper. This was one of my last field notes before I left Cairo, she said, sliding it across the table. A fragment of a shipping manifest in Coptic Greek. The handwriting is poor, but it matches 3 other fragments in the museum's collection. When I presented this link to the curator, he told me to be careful, that making connections where none had been officially sanctioned could damage my career. Jonathan unfolded the paper. The lines of ink were faint, but even to his untrained eye, there was a pattern. Why would they care? Because if these fragments are connected, they suggest a trade network between 2 regions thought to have had no direct contact. That would make certain well-publicized theories obsolete, theories belonging to people in very powerful positions. Jonathan set the paper down. So they buried it. They buried me with it, Evelyn said, her tone matter-of-fact. For a long moment, the only sound was the slow hiss of the snow against the windows. Finally, Jonathan said, I don't know if I should be impressed or furious. Both are fine, Evelyn said. Just don't be surprised. It's not unique to my field. He leaned back, studying her across the table. You know, most people would have fought harder. She met his gaze. I did fight. I just chose a different battlefield. Sometimes survival means living to fight another day. And sometimes, she added, it means stepping away entirely. There was no bitterness in her voice, only the clarity of someone who had made peace with the choice, even if it had cost her dearly. Jonathan understood, in that moment, that her presence in his house was not a mark of defeat, but of discipline. She had walked away from a world that refused to see her, but she hadn't let it erase her. She still carried the knowledge, the skill, the precision. She had simply chosen where and when to reveal it. He poured them both fresh tea from the silver pot on the sideboard, the steam curling into the lamplight. You said last night that the papyrus was personal, not professional. That it carried an astrological marker lovers used. You saw that because you've spent your life seeing what others overlook. Evelyn took the cup he offered. And what do you see, Mr. Lancaster? He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the papyrus case, then back to her. I see that I've been curating objects, not understanding them. I've been collecting for myself, not for the truth they carry. A flicker of something passed over her face. Not quite surprise, but the recognition that he meant it. For the rest of the night, they spoke in quieter tones. She told him fragments of other stories. A graffito she'd uncovered on a temple wall in Luxor, a cache of household accounts from a Greek-Egyptian family in 150 BCE. He asked questions, not as a host trying to impress, but as a student eager to learn. By the time the mantel clock struck 2, the snow outside had deepened, the world beyond the windows reduced to shadow and ice. Jonathan rose to bank the fire, and Evelyn gathered her notes. As she reached the door, she paused. "Thank you for asking," she said. "Thank you for answering," he replied. When the door closed behind her, Jonathan stood for a long moment, looking at the papyrus in its glass case. It no longer seemed like a prize to be displayed. It felt, instead, like a responsibility. The snowstorm broke just before dawn. By the time the first pale light bled over Lake Michigan, the mansion's long windows revealed a world transformed. Streets swallowed in white, tree limbs bent under crystalline weight, rooftops softened into unbroken drifts. The air outside was painfully clear, the kind of cold that bit straight to the bone. Inside, however, the Lancaster house was already stirring. Stranded guests emerged from guest rooms in borrowed sweaters and silk robes, padding down to the breakfast room, where silver urns of coffee steamed beside platters of scones and bowls of winter berries. Staff moved deftly among them, replenishing cups and setting out plates of smoked salmon, herbed eggs, and still warm brioche. Evelyn was in her element, unobtrusive but everywhere, anticipating needs before they were spoken. She poured coffee for a federal judge, replaced the linen napkin for a drowsy museum donor, and slipped a shawl over the shoulders of an elderly senator's wife without a word. Her composure was unshaken, but the events of the past 24 hours hung in the air like a faint electric charge. In the library, Jonathan Lancaster stood before the fireplace with his back to the room, speaking in a low, measured voice to a small knot of influential guests, the same circle who had witnessed Evelyn's translation 2 nights ago. He held a demi-tasse cup as though it were a prop in a play, his posture relaxed but calculated. "Of course," he was saying, "last night's performance was nothing more than a bit of impromptu entertainment. I find that a party benefits from the occasional unscripted moment, don't you?" A couple of the men chuckled, nodding. One, a venture capitalist, said, "Still, she read that thing like she'd written it herself." Jonathan smiled, the kind of smile that suggested indulgent agreement without concession. A lucky guess, perhaps, or an ear for romance, but one shouldn't mistake parlor tricks for scholarship. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Across the room, Helena Voss, who had been in quiet conversation with a guest from the Field Museum, turned sharply. Her silver brows drew together. "Jonathan," she said, her voice cutting neatly through the chatter, "I hope I misheard you." Jonathan lifted his gaze, still smiling faintly. "Not at all. Evelyn is a valued member of my household staff, but let's not be absurd. The world of serious scholarship doesn't operate that way." Helena's eyes flashed. Serious scholarship operates on accuracy, insight, and understanding. She demonstrated all 3 in front of half the cultural leadership of Chicago. "And you're standing here pretending it didn't happen." "It happened," Jonathan replied smoothly, "but context matters. There's a reason curators and directors go through certain channels. Degrees, peer-reviewed publications, institutional backing. These are not trivial. They are also not the sole markers of ability," Helena said, her voice low but dangerous. "And if you cannot see that, you're not half the collector you imagine yourself to be." The conversation had drawn attention. Several guests had turned to listen, their morning chatter cooling into a hush. Jonathan felt the eyes on him, and the old reflexive need to control the narrative tightened around his ribs. He chuckled lightly, as though to break the tension. My dear Helena, I appreciate your passion. But we all know these things must be taken with a grain of salt. The help sometimes surprises us, and that's charming. But let's be realistic. The word help landed harder than he intended. The echo faint but undeniable. Across the breakfast room, Evelyn had paused mid-step, a silver coffee pot in her hand. Her back remained straight, her expression unreadable, but she had heard. Helena took a step forward. You're making a very public mistake, Jonathan. This house is full of people who will leave here and repeat your words exactly, and what they will remember is not your papyrus, but your blindness. Jonathan's jaw tightened. I think you overestimate the weight of gossip. No, Helena said, her voice now cold as the snow outside. I know exactly how heavy truth can be when it's ignored. With that, she turned away, her velvet skirts brushing sharply against the polished floor. The guests who had been eavesdropping dispersed with murmured excuses, leaving Jonathan alone by the fire. Evelyn continued her work without missing a beat. She refilled cups, collected plates, and offered fresh pastries with the same composure she always carried. But inside, a small, steady flame burned, not of humiliation, but of recognition. She had seen this play before, in faculty lounges and conference halls, the reflex to diminish, to keep someone in their assigned place. And as in those days, she understood that silence was sometimes the only shield until the moment came to speak. When the last of the guests departed, wrapped in scarves and led out to thawed cars, the mansion returned to its familiar quiet. The breakfast tables were cleared, the fire in the library banked to embers. Jonathan retreated to his study, ostensibly to catch up on correspondence, but in truth to avoid crossing paths with anyone who might wish to revisit the morning's exchange. Evelyn spent the next hour resetting the East Wing's guest rooms, restoring order to the spaces left rumpled by the storm's forced hospitality. She moved methodically, folding linen with crisp precision, polishing the brass bed knobs until they reflected the winter light like small suns. Only when her tasks were done did she pause in the empty hallway, one hand resting on the polished wood banister. The house was utterly still. From here she could see down into the foyer, past the great doors, to the bright white world outside. The storm had passed, but the air in the house remained heavy. Helena, meanwhile, had not yet left. She found Evelyn in the hallway. Her expression softened from the steel it had worn earlier. I'm sorry, she said simply. Evelyn shook her head. You have nothing to apologize for. You deserved better than what he said this morning. Evelyn met her gaze. What I deserve doesn't matter. What I do next does. Helena's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in the recognition of someone who understood timing, strategy, and the long game. If you ever decide you're ready to step forward, you'll have allies. Remember that. Evelyn inclined her head. Thank you. Helena left soon afterward, her driver having finally cleared a path through the snow-choked streets. The mansion seemed to exhale in her absence, but the conversation she had with Jonathan, and the one she'd just had with Evelyn, lingered like the aftertaste of something sharp. In his study, Jonathan tried to focus on the morning's market reports, but the numbers blurred. The image of Evelyn standing perfectly still in the breakfast room, the silver coffee pot in her hand, replayed in his mind. She had not flinched, had not spoken, had given him nothing to react to. And somehow that unsettled him more than any verbal rebuttal could have. He told himself it was for the best. The social and professional circles he navigated thrived on predictability. To elevate Evelyn would be to invite questions, disrupt balances, risk the discomfort of those whose favor he relied on. It was better, safer, to let last night fade into an anecdote. And yet, beneath the logic, something else itched at him. A voice he could not quite silence whispered that perhaps Helena was right. The true cost of denial was not in protecting his place, but in diminishing what he claimed to value. Evelyn finished her duties just after dusk. She walked the length of the long, narrow servants' corridor to her small apartment above the carriage house. There, she shed the black dress and white apron for a wool sweater and jeans, tying her hair into a loose knot at the nape of her neck. She sat at her desk, a simple pine table pushed against the window, and opened her notebook. By the glow of a single lamp, she began to write. Greek letters flowed across the page, her hand moving with the unhurried certainty of someone returning to a language that had never left her bones. Outside, the snow reflected the moonlight so brightly it seemed to erase the line between night and day. In that strange, silvery glow, Evelyn wrote until her tea went cold, until the house across the courtyard had gone completely dark. She did not know or care if Jonathan Lancaster was still awake in his study, wrestling with his thoughts. She had her own work to do, her own truths to keep alive, even if for now they lived only in ink and memory. The next 2 days passed under skies the color of tarnished silver. The city's pulse slowed beneath the crusted snow, traffic muffled, pedestrians moving in short, purposeful bursts from doorway to doorway. In the Lancaster mansion, the usual rhythm resumed, but something in its cadence had changed. Jonathan had not seen much of Evelyn since the morning in the breakfast room. She moved through the house as she always had, efficient, self-contained, impossible to fault. But he noticed now what he had previously ignored, the way her eyes swept a room in a single glance, noting details without lingering, or how her hands adjusted a vase or straightened a frame almost unconsciously, as though she could not help restoring order wherever she went. That quiet precision had unnerved him at first. Now, it intrigued him. On the third morning, Jonathan sat alone in the library. The papyrus lay under its glass, the light from the tall windows glancing across its surface. He'd been reading the file on its provenance again. The Boston collector, the Cairo intermediary, the layers of authentication. The words were suddenly flat. Without Evelyn's voice, the script seemed less alive. He poured himself a coffee, sat back, and stared at the fire until the thought he'd been resisting pressed forward. He could offer her a role. Not as a charity gesture, she would see through that instantly, but as a genuine invitation to work, to contribute in a way that mattered. It would be a risk. His peers might scoff, his board contacts might question his judgment, but perhaps that was the point. The night of the translation had already shown him that control was sometimes an illusion. He found her later that morning in the small conservatory, trimming the browned edges from a pot of winter jasmine. "Evelyn," he said, and she looked up, one brow lifting slightly in acknowledgement. "Mr. Lancaster?" "I want to speak with you," he said, "privately." She set down the scissors and followed him to the library without a word. Jonathan closed the double doors behind them. The fire was lit. The light filtered through the mullioned windows, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the room was not entirely his. Her presence shifted the balance. "I was wrong," he began. Evelyn studied him, expression neutral. "About what?" "About you. About what I saw that night with the papyrus. About the way I dismissed it afterward." He exhaled. "I told myself it was about protecting order, reputation, all the predictable things. But the truth is, it was pride." She didn't reply, letting the admission hang in the air. It was not her job to make this easier. "I'm offering you something different," he went on. "A position. Not as staff, but as curator of my private collection. You'd have full access to the artifacts, the research materials, even the acquisition process. We could begin with cataloging and expanding the annotations. I can pay you more than double your current salary. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. And what happens the first time a senator at your dinner table decides a former housekeeper isn't a suitable dinner companion for the museum board? Jonathan hesitated. Then, I suppose they won't be invited. Her lips curved, though it wasn't quite a smile. That's a nice line. But you and I both know those relationships are the scaffolding of your world. I'm not saying it will be easy, he admitted, but I'm saying I want to try. I can't change the past, but I can decide who stands in this room from now on. She moved toward the papyrus case, studying it in silence for a moment. Do you know why I didn't tell you my background when I started here? She asked. Jonathan shook his head. Because I've seen how quickly the story becomes about the discovery, as if I didn't exist until someone in power decided I was worth seeing. I didn't need that then, and I don't need it now. I'm not asking to take credit, Jonathan said. I'm asking to work with you, on your terms. On my terms? She repeated. Yes. She turned back toward him. Then here's my condition. If I take this role, you'll end your dealings with the Hanover Group. Jonathan blinked. They've been one of my most reliable partners for years. They're also financing the demolition of the Petoskey ruins in northern Michigan to build a resort. You know what's buried there. Once it's gone forever. Jonathan ran a hand along the mantel, buying himself a moment. The Hanover deal was lucrative, not in the way of money, he had plenty, but in influence. Severing it would be a public signal, one that might cost him political capital he'd spent decades accruing. But Evelyn's eyes held steady on his. This was her test, and they both knew it. Fine, he said finally. I'll withdraw. I'll call them today. Something shifted in her expression then. Not warmth, exactly, but the faintest loosening of the guardedness he'd come to expect. All right, she said. We'll see. That afternoon, he made the call. He was direct, offering no excuses. The Hanover Group's CEO was not pleased. Words like short-sighted and unwise were thrown into the conversation, but Jonathan didn't flinch. When he ended the call, there was a strange lightness in his chest, the kind that came when a weight you'd carried so long you'd stopped noticing it was suddenly gone. 2 days later, Evelyn arrived in the library carrying her leather satchel and a stack of notebooks. She wore a charcoal gray dress, simple but sharply cut, and her hair was pulled back in a smooth twist. Jonathan had cleared the long center table, placing fresh pencils, archival gloves, and a magnifying lens under the tall reading lamps. Where do you want to start? She asked. With this, he said, gesturing to a small, unlabeled clay tablet. It's been in my collection for years. No one's been able to place it definitively. She slipped on the gloves, turning the tablet gently in her hands. It's Aramaic, she said after a moment. Late 5th century BCE. The script's a bit worn, but I'd guess it's a grain ledger from a trading post along the Nile Delta. Jonathan blinked. You got that in 30 seconds. I got that because I've seen its twin in a museum storeroom in Luxor. They worked for hours. She moved through the collection with methodical precision, her notes filling pages in a neat, slanted hand. Jonathan found himself not just impressed, but engaged in a way he hadn't felt in years. The objects became more than acquisitions. They became voices, and she seemed to hear each one. At one point, as she carefully unrolled a fragment of parchment, she said, You realize this isn't just about cataloging. Once these notes are complete, you'll have the basis for a publishable collection. Jonathan leaned back. That's the goal. Her gaze met his across the table. Then you understand that once it's published, my name will be on it. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. For the first time, she smiled without reserve. It transformed her, made her seem, for a moment, not just the woman who had survived academia's exile, but the scholar who had once walked the storerooms of Cairo as if she belonged there. By evening, the library was warm with firelight, the table scattered with artifacts and open notebooks. Jonathan poured them both tea, the rich scent of bergamot mingling with the faint dust of centuries-old paper. "I'll admit," he said, handing her a cup, "I didn't expect you to agree." "I didn't expect you to ask," she replied. They drank in companionable silence for a while, the crackle of the fire a steady background. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, softly this time, without wind, like a quiet acknowledgment from the sky. The first gathering was modest, deliberately so. Jonathan wanted to set the tone before the invitations began to travel farther than intended. The library's long table, usually reserved for quiet reading, had been rearranged into a series of smaller clusters, 4 chairs each, a carafe of water, and neatly stacked notepads bearing the Lancaster crest in the corner. Under the glow of brass lamps, the papyrus lay at the center of the room, its glass case angled toward the assembled guests. They were not senators or hedge fund executives this time. Instead, Jonathan's handwritten invitations had gone to linguists from the University of Chicago, curators from the Field Museum, graduate students with research grants but no institutional clout, and 2 high school teachers from the South Side who ran after-hours classics clubs for their students. He'd even invited an archaeologist from Detroit who'd been blacklisted by a corporate sponsor for refusing to falsify a site report. Evelyn stood near the fireplace, reviewing her notes. She had dressed simply. A navy wool dress, no jewelry except for a slim silver band at her left hand that she turned occasionally without noticing. Her satchel rested at her feet, already half open to reveal notebooks, archival gloves, and a worn copy of Hesiod's Works and Days. Jonathan opened the evening with a few words, a welcome, a nod to the storm-cleared weather, a reminder that the evening's focus was exchange, not exhibition. Then he stepped back and let Evelyn take the center of the room. If Jonathan had been expecting her to shrink from the attention, he was quickly corrected. Evelyn spoke with a calm, precise cadence, guiding the group through the papyrus's physical properties before moving into the historical context of the text. She pointed out the irregularity of the letter forms, the slight slant that suggested a left-handed scribe, the fading along one edge consistent with storage in a leather tube. As she spoke, Jonathan found himself watching not the artifact, but the faces of the listeners. Heads tilted forward, pens scratched against paper, eyes followed every gesture of her hands. There was none of the polite, distracted half-interest he was used to from gala crowds. This was engagement, deep, genuine, and electric. When Evelyn paused to let the group examine a facsimile, the Detroit archaeologist leaned toward Jonathan. "She's the real thing," he murmured. "I don't know how you convinced her to be here, but don't lose her." Jonathan nodded, though the words landed with an ironic twist. A few weeks ago, he had been close to losing her without even realizing what he had. The salons became a weekly fixture. One week they discussed a set of coinage from the reign of Ptolemy II, their worn edges and faded inscriptions revealing clues about trade routes. Another week they examined fragments of linen with inked notations, debating whether they were early accounting records or portions of a lost poem. Sometimes the evening stretched past midnight. The library's fire burned down to embers while voices still traded theories and counter-arguments. Jonathan attended every session. At first he stayed on the periphery, content to listen. But over time he began to ask questions, not to display knowledge, but to seek it. He caught himself lingering after the others had left, discussing details with Evelyn long after the tea had gone cold. It was in those late hours that something shifted. He was no longer thinking about artifacts as trophies or investments. They became stories, and Evelyn was teaching him how to hear them. The backlash began quietly. An email from a longtime patron of the Chicago Antiquities Circle arrived first. A polite but pointed note, expressing concern over the direction Jonathan's events were taking. A week later, at the Union League Club Day, a museum trustee leaned in over a decanter of port and suggested, with a sympathetic smile, that Jonathan might be diluting the brand of his collection by opening the doors to, well, anyone. And then there were the absences. Several of his usual dinner guests stopped replying to invitations. A private acquisition he'd been negotiating with a European dealer was suddenly no longer available. The pattern was unmistakable. Jonathan knew why. In his world, shifting one's focus from elite circles to a broader, less polished audience wasn't seen as generosity. It was seen as betrayal. One evening, after the last guest had left and the library had fallen quiet, Evelyn began stacking chairs back in their usual places. Jonathan lingered by the fire, hands in his pockets. "You've noticed it, haven't you?" he said. She glanced up. "The empty chairs?" "Yes." "They're not just absent. They're leaving on purpose." Evelyn paused, her hands resting on the back of a chair. "And how do you feel about that?" Jonathan thought for a moment. "A month ago, I'd have said it was unacceptable. Now, I'm not sure I care." "You care," she said. "You just care about different things now." Her words landed with a clarity he couldn't deny. He watched her finish with the chairs, her movements unhurried, and realized that the sense of purpose in this room was something his other gatherings had never achieved. The following week, the pushback grew more direct. An old friend and fellow collector cornered him at a fundraiser for the Art Institute. "John, I'm going to be frank," the man said, swirling a glass of Bordeaux. "People are talking. You're making moves that don't make sense for someone in your position." Jonathan kept his voice level. "And what position is that?" "The position of someone who understands the game. You cultivate certain relationships. You keep certain lines clear. Mixing your collection with people who've been shut out of the field. It's risky." Jonathan's gaze hardened. "Risky to what?" "To your standing, and to the perception of value. You bring in too many outsiders, and suddenly your invitation isn't worth what it used to be." Jonathan set his glass down. "Maybe that's the point." His friend blinked, caught off guard. "The point?" Jonathan didn't elaborate. He simply stepped away, leaving the man standing amid the warm chatter of the gallery, frowning into his wine. Back at the mansion, Evelyn heard about the conversation before Jonathan told her. News traveled quickly in certain circles. When he finally brought it up, she listened without comment, then said, "You knew this would happen." "I did," he admitted. "I just didn't expect to mind it so little." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Then you're already breaking the pattern?" The next salon was the largest yet. Word had spread beyond Jonathan's original list, and the library filled with a mix of seasoned scholars, graduate students, amateur historians, and even a few curious neighbors. They discussed a fragmentary funerary inscription, debating its regional origin based on stylistic variations in the carved lettering. At one point, a high school teacher asked a question that sparked a 15-minute discussion on burial customs and regional dialects. Jonathan watched Evelyn navigate it with ease, weaving in the teacher's perspective without condescension, bridging the gap between academic rigor and genuine curiosity. When the evening ended, several guests lingered to thank her. Jonathan stood back, letting her take the center, realizing that this, more than any deal or acquisition, was the legacy worth building. By the end of the month, the change was undeniable. His old social circle had thinned, but the new one was vibrant, unpredictable, and intellectually alive. The library shelves were fuller, not with trophies, but with reference works and research materials Evelyn had requested. The papyrus still lay at the center, but now it was surrounded by context, maps, related texts, cross-references, as if the single artifact had blossomed into a living archive. One night, as they were closing the library after a particularly spirited debate, Jonathan said, "Do you ever regret taking the role?" Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Not yet. It was the closest thing to praise she'd given him, and for now, it was enough. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday morning, tucked in among the usual stack of correspondence that Evelyn sorted at the library desk. Heavy cream stock, embossed with the crest of the American Journal of Classical Archaeology. Inside, the black serif letters announced what she had never expected to see. We are pleased to inform you that your co-authored paper, Personal Correspondence and Astrological Markers in Late Hellenistic Papyrus, has been accepted for publication in our upcoming winter issue. We would be honored if you would present your findings at the annual conference in Chicago next month. Evelyn read it twice, her hand resting on the paper as though to steady it. She had sent the manuscript on Jonathan's insistence, though she'd warned him the journal was fiercely competitive. Its editorial board dominated by the same institutions that had once closed ranks against her. She had not believed it would pass the gate. Now the gate was open. Jonathan entered just as she was refolding the letter. "Good news?" he asked. Her eyes met his. They accepted it. For a moment his expression was unguarded, a flash of genuine delight that made him seem younger, less calculated. "Then we celebrate," he said. "And we make sure everyone who matters knows exactly who wrote it." The conference was held at the Hilton, Chicago, its grand ballroom transformed into a temple of scholarship. Rows of chairs facing a stage backed by a screen, tables lined with copies of newly released books, a steady hum of conversation in the language of specialists. Professors in rumpled suits, graduate students clutching notepads, museum directors wearing their institutional badges like medals. They were all here. Jonathan had insisted on arriving with Evelyn, not simply as her co-author, but as her ally. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his tie a deep burgundy. She wore a simple black dress and a thin gold chain, her hair pulled back in a low twist. No apron, no tray, nothing to tether her to the role she had been assigned for the past 3 years. As they stepped into the lobby, a few heads turned. Recognition rippled through the crowd, though not all of it was friendly. Evelyn caught the quick double-take from a former colleague who had once blocked her from a fellowship panel. Jonathan noticed it too, and his jaw set. The session room was packed. Helena Voss sat in the front row, her emerald scarf draped elegantly over one shoulder, her expression warm with something like pride. Beside her, the Detroit archaeologist from Jonathan's first salon waved discreetly. When the chair of the session introduced them, he began with Jonathan's credentials, board memberships, notable acquisitions, then paused. And joining him is Dr. Evelyn Carter, whose expertise in late Hellenistic epigraphy has brought new insight to this extraordinary find. The doctor was deliberate. Evelyn's name had been printed without it in the official program, but Jonathan had corrected the chair personally before the session began. He wanted the room to hear it. Evelyn took the podium first. She spoke without notes, guiding the audience through the papyrus's unusual features, its personal tone, and the small astrological symbol at the end that had sparked their thesis. Her voice was steady, her hands moving with quiet emphasis. She wove the story of the letter's journey, from Alexandria's sun-baked courtyards to the frozen shores of Lake Michigan, until the room felt suspended between centuries. Jonathan followed, offering the collector's perspective, the provenance trail, the conservation process, the decision to invite open scholarly access rather than keeping it in private storage. He framed it not as magnanimity, but as necessity. An artifact without scholarly context, he told them, was a story half told. When they finished, the applause was not polite. It was sustained, threaded with a low current of murmurs as people turned to each other, already discussing. Afterward, the hallway outside the session filled quickly. A curator from the British Museum asked Evelyn if she'd consider consulting on a new papyrus acquisition. A professor from Princeton invited her to guest lecture. Even a former adversary, the colleague who had once voted her out of a grant competition, offered a tight smile and said, "Impressive work." Jonathan watched it all, content to stand a little apart. For once, the center of the circle wasn't his. When there was a lull, Helena approached. "You've done something rare, Jonathan," she said. "What's that?" "You've shared the stage, and you didn't burn under the lights." He glanced toward Evelyn, who was deep in conversation with a graduate student. "It wasn't my stage to begin with." 2 weeks later, the Chicago Tribune ran a culture feature on the conference. The headline read, "Housekeeper turned scholar, brings ancient love letter to life." The article traced Evelyn's journey from academia to domestic work and back again, carefully framing it as resilience rather than scandal. Jonathan's role was mentioned, but not in the way society pages once preferred. This time he was quoted saying, "If I've learned anything, it's that the value of a collection lies in the minds that interpret it. Dr. Carter's mind is the most valuable artifact I own, and unlike the papyrus, she is not for sale." The line went viral in academic circles. A few in his old social sphere found it gauche. Jonathan didn't care. The next salon at the mansion was the largest yet. The long table was extended to its full length, the fire roaring in the hearth. Guests brought their own artifacts to share. Coins, small fragments of pottery, even a battered Roman brooch one teacher's grandmother had kept in a jewelry box for decades. Before the evening began, Jonathan raised a glass. "Some of you have known me a long time. You've come to my house for galas, for dinners, for reasons that had more to do with wine lists than with the past we claim to care about. Tonight is different. Tonight, I want to introduce you, properly, to the woman who has made me see my own collection for the first time, Dr. Evelyn Carter." The room erupted in applause. Evelyn's cheeks colored slightly, but she inclined her head in acknowledgement. Later that night, after the last guest had left, Jonathan lingered in the library while Evelyn gathered her notes. "You've changed the room," he said. She looked up. "The room?" "The way it feels. The way people behave in it. Before they came to look at what I owned. Now they come to listen. That's you." Evelyn closed her notebook. "Rooms can change. So can people." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Working on it." The winter light was fading when Jonathan stepped into the library, his footsteps muffled by the Persian rug. Outside, the sky over Lake Michigan was a muted wash of blue and gold, the ice along the shoreline catching the last glint of the sun. Inside, the fire burned steadily, casting a warm glow across the long table where Evelyn was finishing notes on a set of newly catalogued tablets. She didn't hear him at first. Her head was bent over the paper, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the page, the other tracing a line of ancient script. The lamplight caught in her hair, turning the dark strands to bronze. Jonathan paused in the doorway, letting himself look at her, not just as the scholar who had rebuilt the meaning of his collection, but as the woman who had rebuilt the meaning of his life. He stepped forward quietly, holding something small in his hand. "I have something for you," he said. Evelyn looked up, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "Another artifact to catalog?" "Not exactly." He set a small velvet box on the table and slid it toward her. She looked at it for a moment before opening it. Inside was a gold ring, simple but unmistakably old. The setting held a Roman coin, its surface worn smooth at the edges but still bearing the profile of the goddess Minerva, helmeted, steady-eyed, the embodiment of wisdom. Evelyn's fingers brushed the coin lightly. Minerva. She seemed appropriate, Jonathan said. She stood for wisdom, strategy, and for protecting what mattered. Evelyn closed the box gently. Jonathan. I'm not asking you to marry the man I was a year ago, he said quietly. I'm asking you to marry the man I've been trying to become since the night you reminded me what truth sounds like. Her gaze searched his, weighing the sincerity against the history they shared, and the history they had survived separately. This isn't about rescuing me, is it? No, he said. It's about building something together, something neither of us could do alone. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she rose and crossed to the display case where the papyrus still lay. She looked down at it for a long moment, then turned back to him. The woman who wrote this letter, she said, promised she'd love her soldier until the stars forgot their places in the sky. Jonathan nodded. That's the inscription I want on the display plaque. Evelyn's brow furrowed slightly. The plaque? I've decided the papyrus shouldn't be mine alone. I'm donating it, along with the annotated facsimile, to the Field Museum. It'll be part of a permanent exhibit on personal correspondence in the ancient world. Her eyes softened. That's not the kind of decision I would have expected from you when we met. He smiled faintly. I wouldn't have expected it from me either. They sat together at the long table as the fire burned low. Jonathan outlined his other plan, the creation of the Carter-Lancaster Scholarship Fund, dedicated to supporting scholars who had been excluded from traditional academic paths, those whose talent had been overlooked, silenced, or forced aside. The fund would provide research grants, travel stipends, and access to collections without the politics of gatekeeping. I want the first scholarships awarded this year, he said, and I want you to decide who gets them. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, absorbing the weight of it. You understand what you're doing, don't you? This changes your name in circles that once defined you. Jonathan met her gaze without flinching. Good. Let them change it. The scholarship announcement was made in the Field Museum's main hall 2 months later. The papyrus stood in a climate-controlled glass case at the center of the stage, the new plaque gleaming beneath the spotlights. Until stars forget their places in the sky, I will remain yours. Translated by Dr. Evelyn Carter. Jonathan spoke briefly, introducing the fund and its mission, but it was Evelyn who drew the longest applause. She spoke not of her own journey, but of the quiet, persistent work of scholars who had been told no too many times, of the archives that would remain silent if not for those willing to listen. When the first 3 scholarship recipients, a community college instructor from rural Iowa, a single father finishing his master's degree, and a self-taught epigrapher from Detroit, took the stage, the room rose in a standing ovation. Jonathan stood beside her, the Minerva coin warm in her hand. That night, after the reception, they walked together along the frozen edge of Lake Michigan. The city lights shimmered on the ice, the wind sharp but clean. I never answered you, Evelyn said. Jonathan glanced at her. You didn't have to. I think I do, she said, stopping to face him. Yes, Jonathan, but only if we keep doing this. Not the galas, not the pageantry. This. The work that matters. He smiled. That's all I want. They stood there for a moment, the lake stretching out into darkness, the stars above steady in their ancient places. In the years that followed, the Carter-Lancaster Fund became known for finding voices others had overlooked. The salons at the mansion continued, their guest lists ever-changing, their debates as lively as the fire in the hearth. The papyrus drew thousands at the museum each year, its final line etched into memory for those who read it. And in the library where it had all begun, a framed photograph hung on the wall. Jonathan and Evelyn, standing together beside the display case, her hand resting lightly on the Minerva ring. Beneath it, in small brass letters, were the words, "Wisdom is not in what you keep, but in what you give away." And so, From a winter night on Chicago's Gold Coast to a library filled with voices from every walk of life, Jonathan and Evelyn's journey came full circle, a reminder that the greatest treasures aren't locked in glass cases, but found in the courage to see and be seen for who we truly are. If you've stayed with us until this final page, thank you. Your time, your presence, and your heart mean more than you know. If you'd like more stories of second chances, quiet courage, and the power of human connection, make sure to subscribe so we can keep walking these roads together. Here's to wisdom, kindness, and building something that lasts, until the stars forget their places in the sky.